A racist woman walked into the restaurant expecting exclusivity, but not like this. When she demanded that Big Shaq leave his own restaurant, she had no idea she was talking to the owner. What happened next shook the entire city. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where you're watching from. Share in the comments below. The sunshine cast a golden hue over the pristine glass doors of Big Shaq's table, a high-end yet welcoming restaurant nestled in the heart of an affluent neighborhood. The establishment was Shaquille O'Neal's vision brought to life, a space where luxury met warmth, where every guest, regardless of status, felt valued. Unlike other upscale dining spots that exuded exclusivity, Shaq wanted this place to break barriers. He didn't care about dress codes or societal ranks. He cared about good food, great company, and an atmosphere that embraced people for who they were. Shaq stood near the entrance, towering over his staff, flashing his signature grin as he greeted guests personally. He wasn't just the owner. He was part of the experience. Wearing a tailored suit with an open collar, he embodied the essence of success, but carried none of the arrogance. He took time to shake hands, pose for photos, and even crack a few jokes, making everyone feel at ease. Inside, the restaurant was buzzing. The open-concept dining space had an effortless blend of modern elegance and cozy warmth. Crystal chandeliers hung above polished wooden tables, their soft glow casting a welcoming ambiance. Velvet booths lined the walls, offering intimate settings, while a state-of-the-art open kitchen allowed diners to witness the artistry of culinary excellence. The menu? A perfect balance between gourmet dishes and comfort food that spoke to Shaq's own roots. Soulful flavors with a touch of fine dining. The staff moved seamlessly, each member handpicked by Shaq himself. From the chefs to the servers, they weren't just employees. They were a family. James Holloway, the senior waiter with decades of experience, led the team with quiet confidence. He had seen the industry change over the years, witnessed both the ugly and the inspiring, and now, working under Shaq, he felt a sense of belonging he hadn't in years. As the evening progressed, guests arrived in droves: NBA legends, A-list celebrities, local business moguls, and even everyday families eager to experience the buzz surrounding the restaurant. There was laughter, clinking glasses, and the hum of genuine enjoyment. It was a rare sight, diversity blending effortlessly in a space that welcomed all. However, not everyone shared the sentiment. At a corner table, a group of well-dressed individuals observed the scene with subtle disapproval. Among them sat Eleanor Whitmore, a woman who carried herself with an air of entitlement. She was a socialite, a figure in elite circles, and someone who believed in the exclusivity that came with wealth. As she sipped her wine, her eyes scanned the room with a quiet sense of distaste. "This place is different," she murmured, her voice laced with underlying skepticism. Her companion, a sleek businessman, smirked. "Shaquille O'Neal owns it. He's turning it into a circus." Eleanor's lips curled in disapproval. She appreciated fine dining, but this was bordering on casual. There was a distinct lack of pretentiousness, a feeling that money alone did not dictate one's worth in this space. And that, to her, was unsettling. Meanwhile, Shaq made his rounds, stopping by tables, ensuring that guests were enjoying themselves. When he finally approached Eleanor's table, he greeted them with the same warmth he had shown to every other guest. "Hey, how y'all doing tonight?" His deep, friendly voice broke through their conversation. Eleanor barely looked up. "Fine," she said curtly. Shaq, unfazed by her tone, continued. "I appreciate y'all coming out tonight. Let me know if you need anything." Her companion, trying to mask his discomfort, gave a tight smile. "Thanks." As Shaq walked away, Eleanor watched him closely. Something about his presence irked her, not just because of who he was, but because he didn't carry the usual air of exclusivity she expected from a restaurant owner of this caliber. It wasn't right. To her, power should come with detachment, with distance. Shaq, on the other hand, was too involved, too familiar, and it didn't sit well with her. The night continued, the restaurant thriving in its inaugural glow. Social media buzzed with live updates from guests praising the food, the ambiance, and the warmth of the staff. Food critics in attendance nodded approvingly at their meals, making notes for their upcoming reviews. However, beneath the success, subtle undercurrents of tension were forming. A few other patrons, much like Eleanor, whispered among themselves. They weren't used to this level of openness, to a fine dining establishment where everyone, from millionaires to working-class families, shared the same space. Some of them, in hushed voices, began to express concerns that this place might not fit the neighborhood. By the end of the night, Shaq stood by the doors, thanking guests as they left. His heart swelled with pride, seeing the smiles, hearing the praise. This was everything he had envisioned. But as Eleanor walked past him, her gaze lingered, a flicker of something unreadable in her expression. Shaq noticed, but he didn't dwell on it. As the restaurant staff cleaned up, James Holloway approached Shaq, placing a firm hand on his shoulder. "You built something special here, boss," he said. Shaq nodded. "Yeah, but I got a feeling this is just the beginning." And deep down he knew, success wasn't just about opening the doors, it was about keeping them open for everyone. Every table was filled, every plate an artful masterpiece, and every guest basked in the warmth of an establishment that exuded both sophistication and inclusivity. Big Shaq's table had in a short time begun redefining fine dining, not just as an experience for the elite, but for anyone who appreciated great food and an even greater atmosphere. Then the double doors swung open. Eleanor Whitmore stepped inside, exuding an air of refined arrogance. Dressed in a fitted navy blue designer dress with a pearl necklace resting delicately against her collarbone, she surveyed the restaurant as if she were a queen inspecting her kingdom. She was used to exclusivity, to restaurants where her presence alone commanded attention. But here, something felt off. The place was elegant, certainly, but there was an ease about it that she found unsettling. The guests, so diverse, laughed freely, their conversations unguarded. A young couple in casual attire sat near a retired professor in a well-tailored suit, both immersed in conversation. A family with children occupied a booth near the back, their joyous chatter unrestrained. It wasn't what she was used to. Her heels clicked against the marble floor as she made her way toward her reserved table near the center of the room. A young hostess, bright-eyed and confident, greeted her with a warm smile. "Good evening, Ms. Whitmore. Right this way." Eleanor followed, her gaze sweeping over the space. The scent of truffle butter and aged steak lingered in the air, but it was another presence that caught her attention. Him. At the far side of the room, standing near a group of customers, was Shaquille O'Neal himself. His massive frame made him unmistakable, his towering height even more imposing in person. But what truly irked her wasn't his size. It was his presence. There he was, laughing, shaking hands, leaning down to take pictures with fans, even playfully fist-bumping a young boy at the table next to him. It wasn't how a restaurant owner should behave, not in a place of this caliber. Owners of high-end establishments remained behind the scenes, orchestrating the night from the shadows. They didn't mingle. They didn't lower themselves to the level of their customers. Eleanor's lips tightened as she settled into her seat. Her dinner companions, Richard Cole and Isabel Foster, were already sipping wine, their body language relaxed, though Richard's gaze followed hers. "Something wrong, Eleanor?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. She picked up the menu, flipping through it without real interest. "This place is unusual," she muttered. Isabel chuckled, setting her glass down. "It's certainly different, but I have to admit, the food is getting quite the praise." Eleanor pursed her lips. "Praise from whom?" Richard smirked. "Everyone, apparently. Social media, food critics, even some of the city's top chefs. Big Shaq's got people talking." Eleanor exhaled sharply through her nose, watching as Shaq made his way toward a nearby table, engaging in easy conversation with the guests. They hung on his every word, not because of his celebrity status, but because he made them feel like they belonged. And that was the problem. She leaned forward slightly. "You're telling me that a man who spent his life dunking basketballs now runs one of the city's most talked-about restaurants? Forgive me if I find that hard to believe." Richard chuckled, swirling the wine in his glass. "You'd be surprised. The man's got business sense, and from what I've read, he genuinely cares about this place. Eleanor scoffed, setting her menu aside. Caring and running a fine dining establishment are two very different things. As if on cue, Shaq's deep, unmistakable voice rang out from a nearby table. Y'all enjoying everything? Need anything, just let me know. And hey, don't forget to try that creme brulee. James back there makes the best in town. The guests laughed, expressing their approval, and Shaq, ever the charming host, clapped a man on the back before moving along. Eleanor turned to Richard, her expression taut. You see? That's exactly what I mean. This isn't some neighborhood barbecue. It's supposed to be an elite dining experience. Isabel sighed, glancing around the room. I think that's the point, Eleanor. It's high-end, but it's also warm, welcoming. She took another sip of wine before adding, Not everyone finds that offensive. Eleanor's fingers tightened around the stem of her glass. She didn't need to say it aloud, but the sentiment was clear. She did. A server approached their table, breaking the tension. Good evening, folks. I'm Devin, and I'll be taking care of you tonight. His tone was polished, professional, but not in the stiff, robotic way Eleanor was used to. There was a casual confidence in his demeanor, a sense that he actually enjoyed his job. Can I start you off with some appetizers? Our seafood tower is a favorite. Richard smiled. That sounds great. Eleanor didn't bother acknowledging the server, merely waving a dismissive hand. Fine. Devin nodded, unbothered by the cold response. Coming right up. As he walked away, Eleanor exhaled slowly, reaching for her purse. I have a feeling this is going to be an interesting night. Richard chuckled, leaning back in his chair. I have a feeling you're not going to like it. Eleanor didn't respond. She simply watched as Shaq moved effortlessly through his restaurant, making people feel welcome, comfortable, and that, more than anything, made her skin crawl. She wasn't just dining at a new establishment. She was stepping into a world where people like her no longer dictated the rules. And she wasn't sure she liked what that meant. Plates clattered in the kitchen, wine glasses clinked at tables, and the scent of seared steak and garlic butter wafted through the space. It was the kind of night that defined Big Shaq's table, lively, inviting, and buzzing with energy. At the center of it all, Shaquille O'Neal moved with his signature charm. He checked on guests, exchanged jokes with the staff, and made sure everything ran smoothly. He wasn't the kind of owner who hid in the back office. He believed in being present, in making his restaurant feel like an extension of his home. On the other side of the room, Eleanor Whitmore was growing increasingly restless. She had watched the way Shaq effortlessly floated from table to table, his deep voice carrying across the room, his presence commanding attention in a way that made her uncomfortable. It wasn't just his size. It was the way people gravitated toward him. Guests lit up when he stopped by, as if he brought a different kind of prestige, one not rooted in old money or exclusivity, but in something else entirely. And that unsettled her. She had expected a refined dining experience, the kind where elegance came with an air of detachment. Instead, the owner was treating the place like a social club, making himself far too familiar with the clientele. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. As Eleanor reached for her wine glass, she noticed Shaq heading toward a nearby table. He leaned down, laughing as he exchanged words with an older couple, his presence far too casual for her liking. When he straightened up, he caught her staring. Their eyes met for the briefest moment, and something in her snapped. She turned to Richard, lowering her voice. Honestly, why is he walking around like that? Richard frowned, taken aback. Like what? Like he belongs here, Eleanor muttered, the words sharp with disdain. Before Richard could respond, Shaq made his way over to their table. Hey folks, how we doing? His tone was warm, effortless. Y'all enjoying everything so far? Richard smiled, but Eleanor barely looked at him. She eyed Shaq up and down, her expression unreadable, before finally speaking. Excuse me, but shouldn't you be at your table? Shaq raised an eyebrow. Ma'am? She gave him a tight, thin-lipped smile, tilting her head slightly. I mean, I understand that this place is accommodating, but I'd really rather not have my dining experience interrupted. The words were carefully chosen, but the intent behind them wasn't subtle. Richard stiffened, and Isabel, who had been scrolling through her phone, suddenly looked up, sensing the shift in atmosphere. Shaq, ever composed, chuckled lightly. "Oh, my bad. Didn't mean to bother you. Just checking in to make sure y'all were good." Eleanor exhaled sharply through her nose. "Yes, well, I think we'd all appreciate it if you left the mingling to the waitstaff." For the first time that evening, a noticeable hush fell over the surrounding tables. The nearby guests, who had been mid-conversation, caught the tension in Eleanor's voice and slowly turned their attention toward the exchange. Shaq remained still, his easygoing smile fading just slightly. He studied Eleanor for a moment, then asked, "Something wrong, ma'am?" Eleanor blinked, as if feigning innocence. "It's just that this is supposed to be a fine dining establishment, isn't it?" She gestured subtly toward the room. "Some of us prefer a certain level of professionalism." Shaq tilted his head. "And what level is that?" Eleanor inhaled, adjusting her napkin in her lap, refusing to be thrown off. "The kind where we don't have random customers wandering around disturbing others." The moment the words left her mouth, the energy in the restaurant shifted. It was subtle but undeniable. The way conversations stalled, the way forks paused midair, the way eyes darted between Shaq and Eleanor, waiting for a response. Richard cleared his throat. "Eleanor." She held up a hand, her gaze never leaving Shaq. "I'm sorry, but if you're not going to be seated, perhaps you should find somewhere else to go." Shaq let the silence stretch between them, his face unreadable. Then after a beat he let out a low chuckle. "You serious?" Eleanor lifted her chin. "I don't see what's funny." Shaq sighed, running a hand over his bald head before slipping his hands into his pockets. "Ma'am, I own this restaurant." The words landed like a brick to the chest. Eleanor's face went pale. Her lips parted slightly, as if she hadn't quite processed what she had just heard. Around them, the restaurant fell completely silent. Even the kitchen, usually alive with movement, seemed to have slowed. Someone at a nearby table let out a soft, "Oh, damn." Richard visibly tensed. Isabel swallowed hard, suddenly looking anywhere but at Eleanor. For a split second, Eleanor looked as if she had been slapped, but instead of retreating, she doubled down. "That may be the case," she said, her voice tighter, her pride forcing her to maintain control. "But that doesn't change the fact that your behavior is unorthodox." Shaq raised an eyebrow. "How so?" Eleanor exhaled sharply. "Because an establishment like this requires a certain standard, and frankly, I don't see why you feel the need to insert yourself into the dining experience." The words came out clipped, measured, but the weight behind them was unmistakable. Someone muttered under their breath, "Oh, she's really doing this." Shaq remained still. The air between them was heavy, thick with something unsaid but deeply understood. He had dealt with people like Eleanor before, people who masked their prejudices under the guise of standards and tradition. He could feel the weight of every pair of eyes in the restaurant. Some were watching in discomfort, others in fascination. A few, he could tell, were silently agreeing with Eleanor, but were too cowardly to say it aloud. After a long pause, Shaq smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Well, ma'am, I hate to break it to you, but this is my restaurant. And in my restaurant, I treat everybody like family." Eleanor scoffed. "Well, perhaps that's the problem." A murmur rippled through the room. The tension peaked, hanging over them like a storm cloud waiting to burst. Shaq took a step back, shaking his head lightly, still smiling. But this time, there was a knowing edge to it. "Tell you what, ma'am, if you're uncomfortable, you're welcome to leave." The words, simple as they were, struck harder than anything Eleanor had anticipated. He wasn't arguing. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even offended. He was simply stating a fact. She was the one who didn't belong. Eleanor, who had spent her entire life holding the upper hand, suddenly felt it slip through her fingers. She opened her mouth, searching for a retort, but the weight of the room bore down on her. The whispers, the glances, the sudden shift in power. For the first time that evening, Eleanor Whitmore had nothing to say. A thick, uncomfortable silence blanketed the restaurant. Every pair of eyes had shifted toward Eleanor Whitmore, waiting for her response, watching how she would navigate the sudden and complete shift in power. The weight of Shaquille O'Neal's words still hung in the air, unshaken and absolute. "I own this restaurant." Eleanor, who had spent decades mastering the art of control, found herself completely stripped of it. Her fingers tightened around the stem of her wineglass, her mind scrambling for a response that would allow her to regain the upper hand. She could feel the stares burning into her, some waiting for her to apologize, others expecting her to make a dramatic exit. But Eleanor Whitmore did not surrender. She let out a short, sharp exhale, forcing a thin-lipped smile as she straightened in her seat. "Ah, well," she began, her voice carefully measured. "That certainly explains a few things." Shaq raised an eyebrow, still standing tall, still unmoved. "And what things would those be?" Eleanor tilted her head slightly, keeping her posture poised, her expression unreadable. "The, unconventional approach to management," she said, choosing her words carefully. "I suppose I should have guessed. A professional athlete owning a fine dining restaurant. It's certainly different." A few quiet gasps rippled through the surrounding tables. A couple at a nearby booth exchanged glances. Was she really doubling down? Shaq studied her for a moment, then let out a low chuckle. "Different, huh?" His tone was light, but there was something behind it. Something steady, unshakable. "Let me guess. You don't think I belong in this business?" Eleanor's lips twitched, but she held firm. "I think," she said carefully, lifting her wine glass but not drinking from it, "that money, not fame, determines true success. A name alone doesn't make someone fit to run an establishment like this." The moment the words left her mouth, a heavy tension settled over the room. A divide formed, invisible but undeniable. Some guests stiffened, suddenly aware that this conversation had turned into something much bigger than a restaurant dispute. Others watched in fascination, eager to see how this battle of worlds would unfold. Shaq nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "So, what you're saying is, I don't deserve to be here?" Eleanor let out a soft, polite laugh. "Oh, let's not be dramatic. It's just, people like me prefer a certain standard when dining out." The words hung there, dripping with implication. Shaq's smile remained, but his voice dipped slightly. "People like you?" A few quiet murmurs rippled through the room. She had said too much. Richard cleared his throat, shifting in his seat. "Eleanor, maybe we should just..." She lifted a manicured hand to silence him, keeping her focus on Shaq. "Listen, Mr. O'Neill," she said, exhaling sharply. "I respect what you've done with your career. Truly, I do. But owning a restaurant, especially one in a neighborhood like this, isn't just about popularity. It's about exclusivity. It's about legacy." She gestured around. "And let's be honest, this isn't exactly the kind of crowd that typically fits into that." A visible shift swept through the restaurant. Some guests tensed in their seats. Others exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to intervene or stay silent. The tension was so thick, it could have suffocated the entire room. Shaq, still composed, rocked back on his heels, nodding slightly. "Ah, now I get it," he said, his voice low but firm. "This ain't about me personally. It's about what I'm doing here." Eleanor tilted her chin up, as if she hadn't just walked directly into his point. "It's about maintaining standards." Mr. O'Neill. Shaq let out a small breath through his nose, shaking his head. "Let me tell you something," he said, his tone shifting. It was no longer playful, no longer casual. It was final. "I built this place for people who love good food, for people who want to come together and feel welcome. I don't give a damn how much money somebody's got, what they look like, or where they come from. If they walk through that door, they belong here." A flicker of discomfort flashed across Eleanor's face, but she refused to back down. And what happens when that inclusivity starts driving away the customers who actually matter? The words were spoken in a soft, cutting tone, but the impact hit like a grenade. The restaurant went dead silent. Even the kitchen, which had still been bustling moments ago, seemed to still. James Holloway, the senior waiter, who had been passing by with a tray, stopped mid-step. Devon, the young server, clenched his jaw from where he stood near the bar. A few customers visibly stiffened. Shaq's jaw flexed slightly. He let out a slow breath, closing his eyes for a brief moment before reopening them, his patience thinning. "You really think money's what makes somebody matter?" he asked, his voice quieter now. Eleanor held his gaze, her expression unfazed. In places like this? Yes. A few murmurs broke out. A couple near the back of the room whispered among themselves, clearly disgusted. Others shifted uncomfortably, waiting for Shaq's response. Shaq took a step closer, his towering frame making Eleanor appear smaller than she had ever looked before. "Let me tell you something about legacy," he said, his voice deep, unwavering. "Legacy ain't about how much money you got in the bank. It ain't about who you know or what circles you run in." He gestured around the room. "Legacy is about what you build. It's about how you treat people. It's about the mark you leave behind." Eleanor scoffed lightly, but there was something different in her demeanor now. A tightness in her posture, a flicker of unease in her eyes. Shaq didn't stop. "You walk in here, talking about people like you. You want to know who my people are?" He gestured toward James, who was still watching from a few feet away. "James over there? He's been in the restaurant business for 30 years, knows more about hospitality than half the so-called elite in this city." James swallowed hard, nodding subtly in gratitude. Shaq pointed toward the bar where Devin stood, his jaw still tight. "Devin? He's the hardest working kid I know. Started bussin' tables, now he's one of my best servers." Devin straightened slightly, his expression unreadable but proud. "And my guests?" Shaq continued, looking around. "They're the ones who come in here, enjoy good food, respect each other, and make this place better just by being here. That's my standard." He looked back at Eleanor, his eyes hard now. "If you don't like it, you can leave." The entire restaurant held its breath. Eleanor sat frozen, her face unreadable, her nails digging into the tablecloth. For the first time in her life, Eleanor Whitmore had no power in the room, no control, no upper hand. And for the first time, she felt what it was like to be on the outside looking in. A suffocating stillness settled over the restaurant, stretching into an uncomfortable pause that no one dared to break. Eleanor Whitmore sat rigid at her table, her manicured nails pressed tightly against the tablecloth, her breathing measured but uneven. Her eyes darted across the room, catching the lingering stares, the silent judgment, the quiet, unspoken verdict. She was losing control. Shaq remained standing, arms folded across his broad chest, his expression calm yet unwavering. The air between them was thick with tension, an invisible battle waged in silence. Every pair of eyes in the restaurant flickered between the two, the energy crackling like an approaching storm. Then, Shaq exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders back before turning toward his staff. His voice was even, but the power in it was undeniable. "We serve with dignity, or not at all." The words landed with quiet finality, not just a statement, but a decision. A code. James Holloway was the first to move. He reached for the check presenter he had been holding and, without a word, set it down on the empty hostess stand. His message was clear. He was done serving Eleanor Whitmore. A ripple of motion followed. Devin, the young server from earlier, nodded in silent agreement, pulling his order pad from his apron and tossing it onto the counter. The bartender, who had been preparing a cocktail, slowly slid the glass aside and folded his arms. Even the kitchen staff, visible through the open design of the restaurant, had stopped moving, their eyes locked onto Shaq in quiet solidarity. One by one, every employee put down their tools, their trays, their pens. Eleanor's eyes narrowed, her posture stiffening. "What is this?" she asked, her voice sharp. Shaq didn't answer. Instead, he simply stepped back, allowing the silence to do the talking. The weight of the moment began to spread beyond the staff. Guests who had initially tried to ignore the confrontation now shifted in their seats, exchanging knowing glances. Some of them, particularly the ones who had once nodded in agreement with Eleanor's words, now found themselves hesitating, rethinking their stance. And then, in a move so subtle yet profound, a couple seated near Eleanor did something that sealed her fate. They turned their backs to her. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't loud, but it was deliberate. Another table followed suit, and another, and another. It was not an outright rejection, but a quiet, collective decision. Eleanor Whitmore no longer existed in this space. Eleanor's fingers curled into fists. She turned to Richard and Isabel, expecting some kind of support. But Richard was focused intently on his half-empty glass of wine, his expression unreadable. Isabel, who had been Eleanor's friend for years, merely reached for her purse and cleared her throat. "I think I'll call it a night," she murmured, avoiding Eleanor's gaze as she pushed her chair back and stood. Eleanor's head snapped toward her. "What?" Isabel hesitated. She glanced around the room, the stares, the judgment, the unspoken shame hanging in the air. "I don't want to be part of whatever this is." And with that, she turned and walked away. Richard sighed, downed the last sip of his wine, and stood as well. "Eleanor, maybe we should just go." Eleanor's jaw tightened, her face flushed red with frustration. "Sit down," she hissed. Richard did not sit down. Instead, he gave a small, apologetic nod to Shaq, then walked away, leaving Eleanor alone at the table. A slow, sinking feeling began to settle in Eleanor's stomach, something she hadn't felt in years, not since she was a child, watching her father command rooms with effortless ease, always the one in control, always the one with the power. And yet, tonight, in this restaurant, power had slipped through her fingers like sand. She exhaled sharply, then raised a hand, snapping her fingers at the nearest server. "I'd like to order now," she said. Her voice clipped, forcing her tone back to one of authority. No one moved. Her fingers twitched slightly. She tried again, her voice louder. "Excuse me? I'd like to order." Still, nothing. James remained standing near the bar, arms crossed. Devon was polishing a glass, but his gaze never flickered in her direction. Even the hostess, who had been standing near the entrance, simply shifted her stance and looked away. It was as if she had ceased to exist. A tight, unfamiliar panic crawled up Eleanor's throat. Her breathing grew shallower, her chest rising and falling quickly. This was not how things worked. People did not ignore Eleanor Whitmore. Her voice trembled slightly as she tried again. "I will not be treated this way," she snapped. "This is a business, is it not? I am a paying customer." Shaq, still watching, let out a slow breath, then finally spoke. "Not tonight, you're not." The words were gentle, but absolute. Eleanor's lips parted, but no sound came out. It was over. The weight of the moment pressed against her like an unbearable force. The realization hit her harder than anything ever had before. She had been rejected, not by force, not by anger, but by silence. She had become irrelevant in a space she once believed she controlled. Eleanor stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. Every movement felt mechanical, as if she was no longer in control of her own body. She reached for her purse with stiff fingers, her breath shallow and uneven. With a sharp inhale, she turned on her heel and strode toward the exit, her heels clicking against the marble floor. No one stopped her, no one called after her, no one even looked up. And as Eleanor pushed open the heavy glass doors and stepped out into the cold night air, she felt something that was both unfamiliar and unforgiving. For the first time in her life, she had been completely, utterly powerless. The next morning, the world woke up to the story. A local journalist, seated at the bar that night, had captured the entire confrontation on his phone. The video was crystal clear. Eleanor's dismissive tone, Shaq's calm but firm response, the moment every staff member refused to serve her, and most importantly, the silent protest that left her no choice but to walk out. By sunrise, the clip had exploded online. Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and every major social media platform was flooded with reactions. Some people cheered the restaurant's stance, calling it a powerful stand against modern-day elitism and discrimination. Others debated whether the silent treatment had gone too far, but what no one could ignore was the overwhelming support for Shaq's restaurant. Big Shaq's table is a masterpiece in action. This is what real leadership looks like. At Foodie Revolution. I love that this wasn't just about one argument. It was about generations of people being excluded from places like this. And now, we take up space. At Real Talk with Danny. Eleanor Whitmore exposed herself, and it wasn't even the loud part of the conversation. It was her casual entitlement. That's what got her. At Ethics and Culture. By the afternoon, news outlets had picked up the story. Reporters stood outside Big Shaq's table, hoping to get a statement. The restaurant's social media pages were flooded with messages of support. Reservations skyrocketed. The wait list, which had already been long, became impossible. The restaurant that Eleanor once deemed unworthy of elite status had now become the most sought-after dining experience in the city. Meanwhile, Eleanor Whitmore had vanished. At first, Eleanor had assumed that the backlash would be fleeting, a momentary controversy that would fade within a few days. She had seen public outrage before. But this was different. By the second day, Eleanor's name was trending, but not in the way she would have liked. Her family name, Whitmore, had always carried prestige. Her father had been a respected businessman, her husband an influential real estate developer. She had spent years crafting an impeccable reputation, a woman of class, grace, and exclusivity. But now, her name had become synonymous with entitlement and quiet racism. News networks replayed the clip, dissecting every word, every gesture, every subtle expression. Old articles resurfaced about her family's history of blocking black homeowners from certain neighborhoods. Journalists dug up old interviews, ones where she had dismissed discussions about systemic racism as overblown or not her concern. She refused to read the comments, but she could feel them everywhere. At the grocery store, she noticed the way cashiers barely made eye contact. At the country club, longtime acquaintances suddenly found reasons to avoid her. The invitations to social events, gone. Even the board members at a charity she had once chaired suggested she take a break for a while. Eleanor Whitmore was becoming a ghost in her own world. The return. On the fifth day, Eleanor did something she never thought she'd do. She returned to Big Shaq's table. It was early evening when she stepped out of her car, adjusting her coat as she faced the restaurant. The warm glow of the chandeliers inside made the place look even more inviting than before. Through the large windows, she could see the restaurant was packed. People were laughing, talking, enjoying their meals, completely unbothered by her presence. For the first time in her life, Eleanor felt something she didn't recognize. She wasn't the most important person in the room anymore. Taking a deep breath, she pushed open the doors and stepped inside. The air shifted the moment she entered. Conversations didn't stop, but they hesitated like a record skipping for half a second. People noticed. Some turned to whisper to their companions. Others simply watched, waiting to see what she would do. At the hostess stand, the young woman who had greeted her days ago stood tall, her expression neutral. "Good evening," she said smoothly, as if Eleanor were just another customer. Eleanor hesitated. Her pride screamed at her to turn around and leave, but that wasn't an option. She cleared her throat. "I'd like to speak to Mr. O'Neill." The hostess's polite expression did not change. "I'll see if he's available." She stepped away, disappearing into the back. The whispers grew louder. Eleanor felt them pressing against her like 1,000 invisible hands. Then, a deep, familiar voice cut through the air. "Didn't expect to see you back so soon." Shaq. He emerged from the kitchen, his massive frame moving with the same effortless confidence. His apron was still tied around his waist, a dish towel slung over his shoulder. He had clearly been working. Eleanor's gaze flickered to his hands, large, strong, still dusted with flour. She had never expected a man of his status to actually cook in his own restaurant, and yet, here he was. She straightened her posture, preparing herself. "I think we should talk." Shaq studied her for a moment, then gestured toward a quieter section near the bar. "All right, let's talk." They sat across from each other, the dim lighting casting soft shadows over their faces. Eleanor chose her words carefully. "I believe this situation has gotten out of hand." Shaq raised an eyebrow. "Which situation?" She exhaled. "This entire controversy." Shaq leaned back slightly. "You mean the part where you told me I didn't belong in my own restaurant? Or the part where the world saw it happen?" Eleanor's fingers tightened around her purse strap. "I may have misspoken." Shaq let out a low chuckle. "May have?" She ignored the jab, pressing forward. "I don't want this to turn into something bigger than it already has." Shaq nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "So, what do you want?" Eleanor inhaled, as if the next words physically pained her. "I'd like to put this behind us." Shaq rested his elbows on the table, his voice steady. That sounds like an apology without an actual apology. Eleanor bristled, her pride wrestling against the reality of the moment. She had come here thinking she could fix this, that a simple meeting, a composed statement, a vague acknowledgement of misunderstanding would reset everything. But Shaq wasn't giving her that option. She folded her hands together, her voice cool but firm. "I'm not here to grovel." Shaq smirked. "Never thought you were." Eleanor glanced around, feeling the weight of the room again. Eyes still flickered toward her. People were watching, waiting to see if she'd admit fault, waiting for her to say the one thing that she never had to say before. I was wrong, but she couldn't. Instead, she forced a thin smile. "I simply wanted to address this in person." Shaq held her gaze for a long moment, then gave a slow nod. "All right. You did." Eleanor hesitated, as if she expected more. A resolution, a handshake, some kind of reassurance that things could return to normal. But nothing came. Shaq stood, tossing the dish towel over his shoulder. "Enjoy your evening, Ms. Whitmore." And just like that, the conversation was over. Eleanor sat still, realizing with a slow, sinking feeling that her visit had changed nothing. She had come here to reclaim control, to salvage her legacy. Instead, she had been dismissed. For the first time in her life, Eleanor Whitmore had learned what it felt like to be irrelevant in a world that had moved on without her. Eleanor Whitmore had always believed in control. Control of conversations, control of her image, control of how the world saw her. But as she stepped out of Big Shaq's table and into the cold night air after her failed attempt at smoothing over the controversy, she realized something unsettling. For the first time, she was no longer in control. The backlash had not faded. Her reputation had not been repaired. And worst of all, she was no closer to understanding why. She had told herself that the world had overreacted, that people were just looking for something to be angry about. But deep down, something gnawed at her. A tiny voice whispering that maybe, just maybe, she had been wrong. And then, an unexpected email arrived. It was from Shaquille O'Neal himself. Eleanor hesitated before opening it. She had expected an ultimatum, a demand, or worse, another public dragging. But instead, it was an invitation. "Ms. Whitmore, we're hosting an event this Friday to celebrate the work we've been doing in the community. I think you should come. No cameras, no press, just people. I figure if you want to put this behind us, you should at least understand what it is you're walking away from. Your choice. Shaquille O'Neal." Eleanor read the message twice, her pulse quickening. It wasn't an attack. It wasn't a challenge. It was an opportunity. And it terrified her. 3 nights later, Eleanor sat in the backseat of her car, parked outside a community center in a neighborhood she had never visited before. Through the large windows, she could see people gathered, laughing, hugging, existing together in a way that felt foreign to her. This wasn't a charity gala or an exclusive fundraiser. There were no champagne flutes or silent auctions. The guests weren't draped in designer gowns or tailored suits. This was something else. Her driver, an older man who had worked for her family for years, cleared his throat. "Would you like me to park, ma'am?" Eleanor hesitated, her fingers tightening around the handle of her clutch. Everything in her screamed to leave, to go home, to pretend this invitation never existed. And yet, a quiet part of her, the part that had started to question everything, made her nod. "Yes, I'll go in." The moment she stepped inside, Eleanor felt out of place. The room was alive with conversation, with laughter, with the kind of energy that didn't come from exclusivity, but from genuine connection. There were local business owners, students, teachers, chefs, activists, people from every background imaginable, their differences not a barrier, but a bridge. Near the front of the room, Shaq stood talking to a group of kids, listening intently as they excitedly told him about their dreams. He wasn't just there to be admired. He was there to learn. Eleanor's arrival did not go unnoticed. A few heads turned, whispers rippling through the crowd. She braced herself for the inevitable stares, the judgment. But then, James Holloway stepped forward. Eleanor tensed as the older waiter approached, a cup of coffee in his hand. He studied her for a moment before speaking. Didn't think you'd actually show up? Eleanor forced a small, polite smile. Neither did I. James nodded slowly, then gestured toward a table. Come sit. We're about to start. She hesitated, then followed. Minutes later, the room quieted as James took the stage. He stood in front of the crowd, adjusting the microphone, clearing his throat before beginning. I wasn't always a waiter, he said, his voice carrying through the space. I had dreams once. Big ones. My wife and I wanted to start our own restaurant. Small, family-run, nothing fancy. Just a place that felt like home. Eleanor watched as the crowd leaned in, hanging onto every word. We saved for years, working double shifts, cutting corners wherever we could. And finally, we found a place. A little house-turned diner. Perfect for what we wanted. He exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. Only problem was, the neighborhood didn't want us there. The energy in the room shifted, the weight of his words settling into every corner. We were denied loans, told the property wasn't for sale, even when it clearly was. One by one, every door shut in our faces. And the people making those decisions? He looked out over the crowd, his gaze landing directly on Eleanor. They looked a lot like Eleanor Whitmore. A few murmurs rippled through the room. Eleanor's breath hitched in her throat. James let the silence linger before continuing. My wife and I never got that restaurant. We spent years working for people who would never let us be their equals. And now, decades later, I watch young people fight the same damn battle we did. The room was silent, save for the occasional sniffle. James inhaled deeply, then smiled. Not a bitter smile, but a hopeful one. But the difference now is that we don't just accept it. We fight. We stand together. And places like this? He gestured toward Shaq and the restaurant employees seated nearby. They remind us that we belong too. The room erupted in applause. Eleanor sat frozen, something breaking inside her that she didn't know how to name. For so long, she had seen herself as a gatekeeper of exclusivity. But tonight, for the first time, she saw what that actually meant, and who it had hurt. As the event wrapped up, Eleanor found herself standing near the exit, unsure of what to do. People were still chatting, laughing, embracing, but she felt like an outsider looking in. Then James approached her once more. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Eleanor found her voice. I didn't know. James studied her, then nodded slowly. I know you didn't. Eleanor swallowed. That doesn't excuse it, does it? No, James said simply. But it's a start. She exhaled, then glanced toward the exit. I should go. James nodded. Take care, Ms. Whitmore. As she turned to leave, Shaq appeared in the doorway, blocking her exit. He didn't say anything, just looked at her. Not with anger, not with resentment, but with something else. Eleanor lifted her chin, searching for words. An apology? A justification? She had neither. Instead, she simply nodded. Shaq nodded back. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't redemption. But it was something different. As Eleanor stepped into the cold night, she realized that for the first time in her life, she was leaving a room without being the most important person in it. And for the first time, she wondered if that was exactly what she needed. The night of the community event had come and gone, but its impact lingered. Conversations about Eleanor Whitmore's past, Shaq's stand, and James Holloway's emotional speech still echoed through the city. Social media continued buzzing, but something had shifted. The focus was no longer on the controversy. It was on the change. At Big Shaq's table, the energy felt different, not just because of the increased reservations, the constant buzz of reporters trying to get an interview, or the overwhelming support from locals. It was something deeper. The restaurant had become more than just a place to eat. It had become a statement. 3 weeks had passed since Eleanor had stepped foot inside the restaurant, and yet, her presence still lingered. Some guests still whispered about her when they walked through the doors, recounting the viral moment that had put the restaurant in the national spotlight. But one morning, before the restaurant had even opened, Shaq walked up to find a small envelope taped to the door. It had no return address, no markings, just his name, written in elegant cursive. He pulled it off the glass, hesitated for a moment, then opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. I've spent my entire life believing that my world was the only one that mattered, that the spaces I occupied were exclusive because they were meant to be, that doors were closed for a reason. But that night at your restaurant, when the doors closed on me, I felt something I've never felt before. I cannot erase my past. I cannot rewrite the mistakes I've made, nor can I undo the harm done by those who came before me. But I can choose what comes next. I may never be welcome at your table again. I understand that. But I hope you'll believe me when I say, I am listening now. Shaq stood there for a long moment, the letter in his massive hands, the morning breeze rustling the paper slightly. He wasn't sure what to make of it. Was it an apology? Not quite. A plea for forgiveness? It was something smaller. A step. He folded the letter and slipped it into his pocket before heading inside. As the days passed, the restaurant continued to thrive. The demand for reservations was unlike anything they had ever seen. More than that, the kind of people walking through the doors had changed. New faces, new stories, a mix of backgrounds, cultures, and histories that blended together in a way that felt so effortless, as if this was how it was always meant to be. People weren't coming just for the food anymore. They were coming for what it stood for. James Holloway, who had spent his life working under people who never valued him, now walked with a new sense of purpose. He was no longer just a waiter. He was a man whose words had started a movement. Devin, the young server, had been offered an opportunity to train as a manager. I don't know if I'm ready, he admitted one evening as Shaq pulled him aside. Shaq grinned, clapping him on the shoulder. Neither was I when I started this place. And then there was Shaq himself. For years, he had opened businesses, invested in companies, put his money in the right places. But this felt different. This was personal. One evening, just before the dinner rush, Shaq stood outside the restaurant, watching as the neon sign flickered to life. He reached into his pocket, pulling out Eleanor's letter once more. He read the words again, but this time he didn't feel anger. He felt understanding. She wasn't redeemed. She hadn't earned back the respect she lost. But she had done something that so many people in her position refused to do. She had acknowledged the truth, and sometimes that was the first step. Shaq turned toward the entrance, where a new sign had just been installed beneath the original one. It was simple, clear, a promise. A place for everyone. And as he stepped inside, the door swinging shut behind him, he knew this wasn't just a restaurant anymore. It was a legacy. What would you do if you witnessed injustice in real time? This isn't just a story, it's a conversation. Who belongs? Who decides? And how do we change the spaces around us? Join the discussion. Share this story. And remember, real change starts when we choose to listen. Subscribe us for more powerful, thought-provoking stories that challenge the way we see the world.